The last time I saw my father alive, he was standing in our kitchen wearing his old army uniform, the one he'd kept pressed and perfect for 30 years. I had no idea that 3 months later I'd be watching 8 soldiers in dress blues carry his flag-draped casket while my own family stood on the other side of the cemetery, pretending I didn't exist. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 28 years I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my family. I was the middle child, the peacekeeper, the one who always showed up when someone needed help moving apartments or a shoulder to cry on. My older brother Marcus had the golden boy status locked down. Successful lawyer, perfect wife, 2 kids who looked like they belonged in a catalog. My younger sister Elena was the artistic free spirit who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, even when she was blowing through her trust fund on another failed pottery business. Dad always said I was his steady one, his rock. Robert Mitchell wasn't a man who threw around compliments easily, but when he looked at me I saw pride, real pride. Not the performative kind he showed when Marcus won another case, or when Elena's latest art show got mentioned in some tiny local newspaper. With me, it was different. Quieter. More solid. That's why what happened on his 70th birthday felt like the ground opening up beneath my feet. It started 3 weeks before the actual date. I was sitting in my small apartment in downtown Portland, Oregon, scrolling through ideas for Dad's party. 70 was a big one, especially for a man who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam and then spent 40 years working construction, his hands growing more weathered with each passing year. I wanted to make it special. I'd already started planning when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Family meeting tonight, Mom's house, 7 p.m. No explanation, no context, just a summons. That should have been my first warning sign. I drove the familiar route to the house I'd grown up in, a modest 2-story colonial in the suburbs, with the same beige siding Dad had painted himself in 1987. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn, creating a carpet of gold and crimson that crunched under my feet as I walked to the front door. Mom answered before I could knock, her face wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. Margaret Mitchell had always been hard to figure out. A woman who kept her emotions locked away like family china, only brought out for special occasions and handled with extreme care. Sarah, good, we're all here. The living room felt smaller than usual with all of us crammed in. Marcus sat in Dad's favorite recliner like he owned the place. His wife Jennifer perched on the arm with her phone in hand, probably checking her social media. Elena was curled up on the couch, her long dark hair falling over her face as she picked at her black nail polish. "So," I said, settling into the only remaining chair, "what's this about?" Marcus cleared his throat, slipping into his lawyer voice. "We've been talking about Dad's birthday party." "Great, because I've been working on some ideas." "Sarah," Mom's voice cut through mine like a blade, "we've decided to handle it ourselves." The words hung in the air for a moment, not quite making sense. "Handle what yourselves?" "The party," Elena said without looking up from her nails. "We're throwing Dad a surprise party, just not involving you." I felt like I'd been slapped. "I'm sorry, what?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Look, Sarah, we know you mean well, but this needs to be done right. Dad's turning 70. This is important." "And you think I can't handle something important?" "It's not that," Jennifer chimed in, finally looking up from her phone. "It's just that Marcus and I have connections. We can get the country club, bring in professional catering, really make it an event." "The country club?" I couldn't hide my disbelief. "Dad hates the country club. He calls it where rich people go to pretend they're not boring." "People change," Mom said firmly. "Your father appreciates nice things now." "Since when?" "Since always," Elena said, finally looking at me. "You just never paid attention." The accusation hit harder than it should have. I'd been paying attention to Dad my entire life. I was the one who remembered he liked his coffee black. No sugar. I was the one who knew he still had nightmares about Vietnam sometimes, and that old war movies made him uncomfortable. I was the one who called him every Sunday without fail. "This is ridiculous," I said, standing up. "I'm his daughter too. I should be part of planning his party." "Sarah, sit down," Mom's voice had that tone that used to make me and my siblings freeze when we were kids. "We've made our decision." "What decision?" "You can't just exclude me from Dad's birthday party." "We're not excluding you from the party," Marcus said carefully. "We're excluding you from the planning." "Because you'll mess it up," Elena added with casual cruelty. "You always do." The room went quiet. I looked around at my family. My mother, my siblings, my sister-in-law, and saw strangers. People who had apparently been having conversations about me. About my inadequacies. About my inability to handle something as simple as a birthday party. "What is this really about?" I asked. Marcus and Elena exchanged a look, one of those sibling communications that happens without words. It was Mom who answered. "Sarah, you're 38 years old. You work at a non-profit that barely pays your bills. You live in a studio apartment. You're not married. You don't have children. And frankly, you don't have the resources or the connections to give your father the kind of party he deserves." Each word was like a physical blow. I stood there, absorbing the assessment of my life from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. "I see," I said quietly. "It's not personal," Jennifer said, though her tone suggested it absolutely was. "It's just practical." "Right, practical." I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. Behind me, I could hear Marcus saying something about not being dramatic, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Sarah, wait." Mom's voice stopped me at the door. "You're still invited to the party, of course. October 15th at the country club. Cocktails at 6. I turned back to look at her, this woman who had raised me, who had bandaged my scraped knees and helped me with homework and taught me how to drive. Why? Why what? Why are you doing this to me? For just a moment, something flickered across her face, something that might have been regret, or sadness, or even love. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "We're doing what's best for everyone," she said. I left without another word. The next 3 weeks were torture. I threw myself into work, staying late at the Portland Community Outreach Center, where I'd been a program coordinator for 5 years. My boss, Karen, kept asking if I was okay, but how could I explain that my family had decided I wasn't good enough to plan my own father's birthday party? I considered calling Dad directly, but what would I say? "Hey, Dad, did you know your wife and other children think I'm such a failure that they can't trust me with party planning?" Instead, I did what I always did when my family hurt me. I pretended it didn't matter and tried to be the bigger person. But it did matter. It mattered so much that I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept replaying that night in Mom's living room, picking apart every word, every look, every casual dismissal of my worth. The day of the party arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather in Portland. I'd spent an hour getting ready, changing outfits 3 times, before settling on a simple black dress that wouldn't embarrass my family. I'd even bought Dad a gift, a photo album filled with pictures from his construction days, images I'd gathered from his old coworkers and friends. It had taken me weeks to put together, calling around to people I barely knew, asking them to dig through old boxes for pictures of my father. But as I sat in my car outside the country club, watching people in expensive clothes walk through the entrance, I couldn't bring myself to go in. I called Marcus. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Sarah, where are you? The party started 20 minutes ago." "I'm outside. I don't think I can do this." "What are you talking about?" "I feel like I don't belong here, like you've made it pretty clear I don't belong anywhere." There was a pause. In the background I could hear music and laughter, the sound of people having a good time at my father's birthday party. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. Just come inside." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Is Dad having fun?" He's fine. He keeps asking where you are." That broke something inside me. "He's asking for me?" "Sarah, just come inside. We can talk about this later." "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I don't think I will." I hung up and drove home, still wearing my black dress, still holding the photo album I'd never give to my father. That night, I wrote Dad a letter. I told him about the party I would have thrown for him. A backyard barbecue with his old work buddies, his favorite beer, and the classic rock music he loved. I told him about the photo album, about how proud his former coworkers were of him, about how much he meant to me. I told him I was sorry I couldn't be there for his 70th birthday and that I hoped he knew how much I loved him. I never sent it. 2 weeks later, Dad had a heart attack while working in his garden. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The call came at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I was staring at my computer screen, trying to focus on a grant application for our youth mentorship program, when my phone started buzzing against my desk. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice sounded strange, hollow. "You need to come to the hospital, it's Dad." The drive to Oregon Health and Science University felt like it took forever and no time at all. I kept hitting red lights, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Part of me was praying, even though I hadn't been to church since high school. Please let him be okay. Please let me have a chance to fix things. But when I burst through the emergency department doors, the look on Marcus's face told me everything I needed to know. "He's gone," he said simply. Mom was sitting in a plastic chair, staring at nothing. Elena was pacing back and forth, her artist's hands shaking as she tried to light a cigarette that a nurse had already told her she couldn't smoke inside. Jennifer was on her phone, probably calling her mother or posting something on social media about the tragedy. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Heart attack," Marcus said. "He was planting those mums he bought for Mom's birthday next month. Mrs. Peterson from next door found him about an hour later." An hour. He'd been lying in the garden for an hour while I sat at my desk, completely unaware that my world was falling apart. Was he in pain? Doctor said it was quick, massive coronary, he wouldn't have suffered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The last time I'd seen him was at Sunday dinner 3 weeks ago, right after the country club party. He'd seemed tired, maybe a little sad, but I'd assumed it was because he was disappointed in how the party had gone. Now I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something. "We need to make arrangements," Mom said suddenly, her voice cutting through the fog of grief. "The funeral home, the service, all of it." "I can help," I started. "No," the word came out sharper than she probably intended. "Marcus will handle it. He knows what your father would have wanted." I felt that familiar sting of exclusion. Even here, even now. "Mom, I'm his daughter too. And you'll be treated as such at the funeral." She stood up, smoothing down her skirt. "But the arrangements need to be made by someone who understands these things." "What things?" "Important things. Adult things." The words hung in the air between us like a slap. Even in death, even in grief, I was still the family failure who couldn't be trusted with anything that mattered. Over the next few days, I watched my family plan my father's funeral the same way they'd planned his birthday party, without me. Marcus handled the funeral home, choosing an expensive casket and a package that cost more than I made in 3 months. Elena designed a memorial program with one of her artistic touches, full of swirling fonts and dramatic imagery that looked nothing like the simple man our father had been. Jennifer managed the flowers, ordering elaborate arrangements that would have made Dad uncomfortable. Mom coordinated everything else with the efficiency of a military operation, which was ironic considering what I would learn later. I tried to contribute where I could. I offered to write Dad's obituary, since I'd always been good with words, but Marcus had already hired a professional writer. I suggested we include some of his construction buddies in the service, but Mom said they wouldn't fit with the tone she was going for. When I asked if I could speak at the funeral, Elena laughed. "Sarah, you couldn't even handle being at his birthday party. What makes you think you can handle speaking at his funeral?" The service was held at St. Mary's Cathedral, a grand stone building downtown that Dad had never set foot in. He'd been raised Methodist in a small church that had been demolished years ago to make room for a shopping center. But St. Mary's was where important people held their funerals, according to Mom. I sat in the front row, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to his birthday party, feeling like an outsider at my own father's funeral. The priest spoke about a man I didn't recognize, using words like distinguished and prominent community member that had nothing to do with the guy who taught me how to change a tire, and always kept a cooler of beer in the garage for when his work buddies stopped by. Marcus gave a eulogy that sounded like it had been written by a corporate communications team. Elena read a poem she'd written that was more about her artistic process than about Dad. Jennifer somehow managed to work in a story about how Dad had always loved her kids, even though he'd seen them maybe 6 times in the past year. I wasn't asked to speak. After the service, we drove to Forest Hills Cemetery for the burial. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray and heavy, threatening another downpour. I stood with my family around the gravesite, watching the priest say final prayers over a casket that was far too fancy for a man who'd worn the same work boots for 15 years. That's when I saw the cars. 3 black sedans pulled up to the cemetery entrance, moving in perfect formation. At first, I thought they might be lost. Or maybe there was another funeral somewhere else in the cemetery. But then the doors opened, and 8 men in military dress uniforms stepped out. Army uniforms. Perfectly pressed, with ribbons and medals that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. "What's going on?" Elena whispered. Marcus frowned, looking as confused as the rest of us. "I don't know." The soldiers moved with precise military bearing, walking in formation toward our small group. The lead soldier, a sergeant with silver hair and kind eyes, approached Mom. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant First Class David Torres, United States Army. We're here to honor Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell." Mom's face went pale. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My husband was never in the Army." Sergeant Torres's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Mitchell served with distinction in the 101st Airborne Division. 2 tours in Vietnam, 1969 to 1971. He was awarded the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Vietnam Service Medal." The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, like everything I thought I knew about my father was rearranging itself into something completely different. "That's impossible," Marcus said. "Our father never served in the military." "Sir, I understand this might be confusing, but we have documentation. Staff Sergeant Mitchell was a decorated veteran who served his country with honor." One of the other soldiers stepped forward, carrying a carefully folded American flag. "We're here to provide military honors for his funeral service, as is his right as a veteran." Mom was shaking her head. No, this is wrong. Robert worked construction his whole life. He never mentioned the military, never talked about Vietnam. You have the wrong person." But even as she said it, I could see doubt creeping into her expression. Things that had never made sense suddenly clicking into place. Dad's nightmares. The way he got quiet during 4th of July fireworks. How he always changed the channel when war movies came on television. The box in the basement that he'd always told us contained old construction paperwork, and that we should never touch. "Ma'am," Sergeant Torres said gently, "your husband was a private man about his service. Many veterans from that era chose not to discuss their experiences. But his military records are clear. He served with honor, and he deserves to be honored." I watched my family try to process this information. Marcus kept shaking his head, as if he could tell it to be untrue. Elena had gone completely still, her artistic mind probably trying to fit this new information into the picture she'd built of our father. Jennifer was texting someone, probably her mother, to tell her about this bizarre turn of events. But Mom was staring at the soldiers with an expression I'd never seen before. Something that looked almost like fear. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "How did you know he died?" "We maintain contact with our veterans, ma'am. When we learned of Staff Sergeant Mitchell's passing, we reached out to arrange honors. We've been trying to coordinate with the family, but there seems to have been some confusion with the arrangements." Marcus stepped forward, slipping back into his lawyer persona. "What kind of documentation do you have?" Sergeant Torres nodded to another soldier, who produced a folder. Military service records, commendation citations, medical records from his service-connected injuries. Everything is properly authenticated. As Marcus reviewed the documents, his face grew paler. This is definitely our father. Same social security number, same birth date, everything matches." "Of course it does," Sergeant Torres said. "We don't make mistakes about our own." The priest had been waiting patiently through this entire exchange, but now he cleared his throat. Perhaps we should proceed with the burial service, and the family can sort out these details afterward. Actually, sir, Sergeant Torres said respectfully, with the family's permission, we'd like to provide military honors. It's what Staff Sergeant Mitchell earned. I found my voice for the first time since the soldiers had arrived. Yes. Everyone turned to look at me. Yes, I repeated, louder this time. He should have military honors. Sarah, Mom said sharply, you don't understand. I understand that Dad served his country and never told us about it. I understand that he was a decorated veteran who deserves to be honored properly. And I understand that for some reason, you don't want that to happen. The accusation hung in the air between us. Mom's face flushed and I could see her struggling for words. It's not that simple, she said finally. It seems pretty simple to me, I said. These soldiers came here to honor their brother-in-arms. The least we can do is let them. Marcus was still looking through the documents, his lawyer's mind trying to find some flaw, some reason to dismiss what was right in front of him. But there was nothing to dismiss. The evidence was overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Mitchell was a good soldier, one of the younger soldiers said quietly. He saved lives in Vietnam. He deserves to be remembered for that. Elena finally spoke up, her voice small and confused. Why didn't he tell us? Sergeant Torres's expression softened. Ma'am, many veterans of that era came home to a country that didn't welcome them. They learned to keep their service private, to protect themselves and their families from the political climate of the time. It doesn't mean they weren't proud of their service. I thought about all the times Dad had seemed distant, all the moments when he'd stared off into space during family dinners, all the nights when I'd heard him walking around the house when everyone else was asleep. I'd always assumed he was thinking about work, about bills, about ordinary worries. Now I wondered if he'd been thinking about things none of us could imagine. We should let them do this, I said to my family. It's what he earned. Mom looked like she was about to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped her. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't backing down. I wasn't trying to keep the peace or avoid conflict. I was standing up for what was right. Fine, she said finally. Do whatever you want. But as the soldiers prepared for the honors ceremony, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Something about Mom's reaction, about the way she'd seemed genuinely shocked, didn't add up. She'd been married to Dad for 43 years. How could she not have known about his military service? Unless she had known, and had chosen to keep it secret for reasons I couldn't understand. The military honors were beautiful and heartbreaking. The soldiers performed their duties with precision and respect, folding the flag that had covered Dad's casket into a perfect triangle. When Sergeant Torres presented it to Mom, she held it like it might burn her. On behalf of a grateful nation, he said, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your husband's honorable and faithful service. Mom nodded, unable to speak. For the first time since Dad's death, I saw real emotion on her face. Not the controlled grief she'd been displaying, but something rawer, more complex. As the ceremony concluded and the soldiers prepared to leave, Sergeant Torres approached me. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that your father was a hero. What he did in Vietnam, it mattered. He saved lives, and he never talked about it because that's the kind of man he was. Humble, honorable. Thank you for being here, I said. It means more than you know. He handed me a business card. If you ever want to know more about your father's service, please call me. There are stories that should be told, honors that should be recognized. I took the card, feeling its weight in my hand. I will. As the soldiers drove away, my family stood around Dad's grave in stunned silence. The revelation about his military service had changed everything, shifting the foundation of everything we thought we knew about him. But it had also raised questions that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Questions about why Mom had seemed so shocked, why Dad had never mentioned his service, and why I felt like there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered. The graveside service concluded with the mechanical lowering of the casket. I watched the expensive wooden box disappear into the ground, taking with it the man who had apparently been far more complex than any of us had realized. As we walked back to our cars, Elena caught up with me. Sarah, I'm sorry about what I said, about the funeral, about everything. I looked at her, this sister I'd grown up with, and realized I didn't know her any better than I'd known Dad. Which part are you sorry about? All of it. The way we treated you, the way we excluded you from everything, it was wrong. Yes, it was. She seemed surprised by my directness. I thought you'd be more forgiving. I'm tired of forgiving, I said. I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt when my family treats me like I don't matter. Marcus joined us, still holding the folder of military documents. We need to talk about this, he said, about what we're going to do with this information. What do you mean? I mean, Dad kept this secret for a reason. Maybe we should respect that. I stared at him. You want to cover this up? I want to be careful. There might be things about Dad's service that he didn't want us to know. Things that could be difficult. Or maybe, I said, there are things about Dad's service that we should know. Things that would help us understand him better. The tension between us was thick enough to cut. We were standing in a cemetery, having buried our father an hour ago, and we were already fracturing along familiar lines. I'm going to call that sergeant, I said. I'm going to find out what Dad really did in Vietnam. Sarah, Mom said sharply, leave it alone. Why? I turned to face her. Why are you so afraid of us learning about Dad's military service? She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. Real, genuine fear. Because, she said quietly, some doors are better left closed. But I was done leaving the doors closed. I was done accepting partial truths and family secrets. I was done being the one who always backed down. Dad had been a decorated veteran, a hero who had served his country with honor. And I was going to find out why he'd never told us about it, even if it meant uncovering truths that my family would rather keep buried. The ride home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts about this new reality, but for the first time in weeks I felt a sense of purpose. I had a mission now, a way to honor my father's memory that had nothing to do with expensive caskets or cathedral services. I was going to learn who Robert Mitchell really was, beyond the construction worker and father we'd known. I was going to uncover the soldier he'd been, the hero he'd hidden from us. And I was going to find out why that secret had been so important that he'd taken it to his grave. I waited exactly 3 days after the funeral before calling Sergeant Torres. 3 days of staring at his business card, 3 days of my family texting me to, let sleeping dogs lie, 3 days of wondering if I was about to open a door I couldn't close. His voice was warm when he answered, like he'd been expecting my call. Miss Mitchell, I'm glad you reached out. I was hoping you would. I need to know about my father's service, I said without preamble. Everything. What he did, why he never told us, all of it. That's a conversation we should have in person. Are you free this afternoon? We met at a small diner in southeast Portland, the kind of place Dad would have liked. Worn vinyl booths, coffee that could strip paint, and a waitress who called everyone on. Sergeant Torres was already there when I arrived, dressed in civilian clothes that somehow still looked military. Your father was a remarkable man, he said as I slid into the booth across from him. What I told you at the cemetery was true, but it was just the beginning. He pulled out a manila folder, much thicker than the one Marcus had looked at. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell served with the 101st Airborne Division, 1st Brigade, 3rd Battalion. He was what we called a tunnel rat. I frowned. A what? Vietnam was full of underground tunnel systems used by the Viet Cong. Complex networks that could stretch for miles, with living quarters, weapons storage, hospitals, everything. The only way to clear them was to send soldiers down into the tunnels. Small soldiers, usually. Men who could fit in spaces barely wide enough for a human body. The coffee I'd been drinking suddenly tasted like ash. Dad went into tunnels? Your father volunteered for tunnel duty. It was dangerous work, maybe the most dangerous job in Vietnam. The tunnels were booby-trapped, filled with snakes and rats, and you never knew when you'd run into enemy soldiers in the dark. Most tunnel rats didn't make it through their first tour. I thought about my father's broad shoulders, his 6-foot frame. But Dad wasn't small. No, he wasn't. But he was brave, and he had something most soldiers didn't have. The ability to stay calm in impossible situations, that's what made him so effective. Sergeant Torres opened the folder and pulled out a black and white photograph. It showed a group of young soldiers in jungle fatigues, their faces dirty and exhausted. I recognized Dad immediately, even though he looked impossibly young. That was taken after a particularly difficult mission, Torres explained. Your father had just spent 18 hours in a tunnel system, mapping it and clearing booby traps so the rest of the unit could follow. He saved a lot of lives that day. What happened to him down there? Torres's expression grew serious. That's where it gets complicated. On his second tour, your father's unit was sent to clear a tunnel system near Siu Chi. Intelligence suggested it was a major Viet Cong stronghold. What they found instead was a network of tunnels being used as a refugee camp. My stomach clenched. Civilians? Families, women, children, elderly people, who had nowhere else to go. The tunnels were their shelter, their protection from the bombing campaigns. Your father was the first one down, the first one to see them. I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Miss Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you isn't in any official reports. Your father made sure of that. What do you mean? The standing orders were clear. All tunnels were to be cleared by any means necessary, no exceptions. But your father, he made a different choice. Torres pulled out another document, this one handwritten. This is from your father's journal. He kept detailed notes about his missions, but this entry was different. He handed me the paper, and I recognized Dad's careful handwriting immediately. Found them today. 15 families, maybe more. Kids who can't be older than 5 or 6. They're not fighters, they're just scared. Command says clear the tunnels, but clearing means killing. I can't do it, won't do it. There has to be another way. What did he do? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. He contacted a Catholic priest in Saigon, Father McKenna, who is running an underground operation to help refugees. Your father spent the next 3 weeks secretly evacuating those families, one by one, through a different tunnel exit that led to a Buddhist monastery outside the city. I stared at the journal entry, trying to process what I was reading. He saved them? All of them. 63 people, including 22 children. He risked court-martial, prison, everything. But he got them out. And nobody knew? His commanding officer suspected something, but your father was too good at his job for anyone to question him directly. He filed reports saying the tunnels were empty, that the intelligence had been wrong. Technically, he was lying to his superiors. The pieces were starting to fall into place. That's why he never talked about Vietnam. He was protecting people, but he had to break the rules to do it. More than that, Torres said. 3 weeks after he evacuated the last family, American forces bombed the tunnel system, if those families had still been there. He didn't need to finish. I understood. There's more, Torres continued. Your father was wounded during the evacuation, not in combat, but in a tunnel collapse, while he was helping an elderly woman get to safety. That's how he got his second Purple Heart, though the official report says he was injured during a reconnaissance mission. I looked at the photograph again, studying my father's young face. He looked tired, but there was something else in his eyes, something I'd seen occasionally when I was growing up, usually when he was helping a neighbor fix their car, or when he was working on one of his construction projects. Pride. Quiet, humble pride. After the war, your father stayed in contact with Father McKenna. He sent money to help the refugees he'd saved get settled in America. Some of them eventually made it to the States, and your father helped them find jobs, places to live. What happened to them? Torres smiled for the first time since I'd sat down. They're all over the country now, doctors, teachers, business owners. One of the children your father saved is now a pediatric surgeon in Seattle. Another owns a chain of restaurants in California. They all remember him. I felt overwhelmed, like I was learning about a completely different person who happened to share my father's name. Why didn't he tell us any of this? Because he was ashamed. Ashamed? He saved innocent people. He broke military law to do it. In his mind, he was a soldier who had disobeyed orders. He never saw himself as a hero, just as someone who had compromised his duty. I thought about all the times Dad had seemed distant, all the moments when he'd stared off into space during family dinners. I'd always assumed he was thinking about work, about bills, about ordinary worries. Now I wondered if he'd been thinking about those families, about the choices he'd made in a jungle on the other side of the world. "There's something else," Torres said. "Your father continued his work after the war, not with refugees, but with other veterans. He helped soldiers who were struggling with addiction, homelessness, PTSD. He never advertised it, never told anyone. He just quietly helped people." "How do you know all this?" "Because I was one of them." The words hit me like a physical blow. Torres had been speaking so professionally, so matter-of-factly, that I'd forgotten he was also a veteran. "I came back from Iraq in 2004, he continued. "I was a mess, drinking too much, couldn't hold a job, couldn't sleep. I ended up on the streets in Portland, just another homeless vet that people pretended not to see. Your father found me outside a VA clinic one day." "What did he do?" "He brought me home. Your mother wasn't happy about it, but your father didn't care. He let me sleep on your couch for 3 months while I got clean. He helped me find work, helped me get my life back together. He saved my life." I remembered now, vaguely, a man who had stayed with us for a while when I was in high school. Dad had introduced him as an old friend who was between jobs. I'd barely paid attention, too wrapped up in teenage drama to care about some stranger sleeping on our couch. "He did that for other people too," Torres said. "Veterans who needed help, who had nowhere else to turn. He'd bring them home, help them get back on their feet, and then they'd move on. He must have helped dozens of people over the years." "And Mom knew?" Torres's expression grew complicated. "Your mother knew about the veterans he helped. She wasn't always happy about it, but she accepted it. What she didn't know was the extent of his Vietnam service. He never told her about the families he saved, about the tunnel work, about any of it. But she was his wife. How could she not know? Your father was very good at keeping secrets. He told her he'd been a supply clerk, that he'd never seen combat. She believed him because she wanted to believe him. The nightmares, the jumpiness around loud noises. She thought it was just stress from adjusting to civilian life." I thought about Mom's reaction at the cemetery, the way she'd seemed genuinely shocked by the revelation of Dad's military service. If she'd known he'd been a supply clerk, the idea that he'd been a decorated combat veteran would have been overwhelming. "Miss Mitchell, there's one more thing I need to tell you." I braced myself, not sure I could handle any more revelations. "Your father left something for you. Specifically for you." Torres reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal box, the kind used to store important documents. "He gave this to me 6 months ago, when his health started declining. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got it." "Why me?" "Because you were the only one who really saw him, the only one who understood what kind of man he was, even if you didn't know the details." I took the box with trembling hands. It was heavier than I'd expected, and there was an envelope taped to the top with my name written in Dad's careful handwriting. "I'll leave you alone to open it," Torres said, starting to slide out of the booth. "No, please stay. I don't want to do this alone." He settled back into his seat as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written on Dad's construction company letterhead. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then David Torres has done what I asked and told you about Vietnam. I know this must be confusing, learning about a part of my life I never shared with you. I'm sorry for keeping it a secret, but I couldn't find a way to explain it without explaining everything, and some stories are too heavy to put on your children. I want you to know that you were always the one who understood me best. When you were little, you used to ask me why I got sad sometimes, and I would tell you I was just tired. You would climb into my lap and pat my cheek and say, 'It's okay, Daddy. Tomorrow will be better.' You were the only one who saw past my moods to the person underneath. In this box, you'll find my medals and some photographs from Vietnam. There's also information about the families I helped, including current contact information for many of them. They would like to meet you, to tell you about your father from their perspective. You don't have to contact them if you don't want to, but I thought you should have the choice. I'm proud of who you've become, Sarah. You work with people who need help, just like I did. You see the good in people, even when they can't see it themselves. You're exactly the kind of person I hoped you'd grow up to be. Don't let your mother and siblings make you feel like you're not enough. You are enough. You have always been enough. Love, Dad. P.S. The birthday party you would have planned for me would have been perfect." Backyard barbecue, old work buddies, classic rock music. That's who I really was, not the man they tried to create at that country club. Thank you for seeing me. I was crying before I finished reading, tears dropping onto the paper and smudging the ink. Torres handed me a napkin without saying anything. Inside the box were Dad's medals, including the Bronze Star and Purple Hearts that Torres had mentioned. There were photographs of him with his unit, with the refugees he'd saved, with veterans he'd helped over the years. At the bottom was a small address book filled with names and phone numbers. He kept in touch with all of them, Torres explained. The families from Vietnam, the veterans he helped, everyone, he never forgot anyone. I picked up one of the photographs. It showed Dad, much older, standing with an Asian family at what looked like a graduation ceremony. A young woman in a cap and gown was holding a diploma, and Dad was beaming with pride. That's Dr. Lisa Nguyen, Torres said. She was one of the children he saved from the tunnels. She graduated from medical school in 2018. Your father was there. He went to her graduation? He went to all of them. Graduations, weddings, important moments. He was like a father to many of those people. I studied the photograph, looking at Dad's face. He looked happier than I'd ever seen him. Proud in a way that was completely different from how he'd looked at Marcus's law school graduation or Elena's art shows. I need to contact these people, I said. I need to hear their stories. I think your father would like that. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything Torres had told me settling over me like a blanket. My father hadn't just been a construction worker who happened to be a veteran. He'd been a hero, a man who had risked everything to save innocent people, and had spent the rest of his life quietly helping others. Why didn't he tell us? I asked. Why keep it all secret? Torres considered the question carefully. I think he was afraid that if people knew what he'd done in Vietnam, they'd expect him to be someone he wasn't. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wanted to be a good man. But he was a hero. Yes, he was. But he was also your father, and I think that's what mattered most to him. I closed the box, holding it against my chest. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I was beginning to understand him. Not just the man who had raised me, but the person he'd been before I was born, and the person he'd continued to be throughout my life. What happens now? I asked. Now you decide what to do with this information. You can keep it private, like he did. Or you can share his story, let people know what kind of man he really was. I thought about my family, about their reaction to learning about Dad's military service. They'd been shocked, confused, maybe even embarrassed that they hadn't known. But they hadn't been curious. They hadn't wanted to dig deeper, to understand what his service had meant. I'm going to tell his story, I said. I'm going to make sure people know what he did. Torres smiled. I think he'd be proud of that choice. As I left the diner, carrying the box of Dad's medals and memories, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. I finally understood why I'd always felt different from the rest of my family. Why I'd chosen to work with people who needed help instead of pursuing success or money. I was my father's daughter, carrying on his legacy of quiet heroism in my own way. And I was done being ashamed of that. The first call I made was to Dr. Lisa Nguyen. Her number was written in Dad's careful handwriting at the top of his address book, with a small star next to it. When she answered, her voice was soft and professional, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering both good news and bad to anxious families. Dr. Nguyen? This is Sarah Mitchell, Robert Mitchell's daughter. The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats before I heard a sharp intake of breath. Sarah, she said, and her voice broke slightly on my name. I heard about your father's passing. I'm so sorry. He was everything to my family. I'm calling because I just learned about Vietnam, about what he did for your family. You didn't know? The surprise in her voice was genuine. But surely he told you stories, talked about the war? He never mentioned Vietnam, not once. I found out at his funeral when Army soldiers showed up to provide military honors. Another long pause. May I ask, how much do you know? Sergeant Torres told me about the tunnels, about the families Dad evacuated. But I want to hear it from someone who was there. Dr. Nguyen's voice grew stronger, more determined. Then you need to come to Seattle, and you need to bring your family, all of them. 3 days later, I was sitting in the lobby of Swedish Medical Center, waiting for Dr. Nguyen to finish her rounds. I'd driven up alone. Marcus had a court case he couldn't reschedule, Elena was opening a new art installation, and Mom had simply refused to come. Jennifer had actually laughed when I'd called to invite her, as if the idea of traveling to meet refugees Dad had saved was somehow absurd. They're too busy with their important lives to care about Dad's actual legacy, I'd told myself during the 4-hour drive north. But the truth was, their absence hurt. Even now, even after everything I'd learned, my family was choosing to ignore the most significant part of Dad's life. Dr. Nguyen appeared at exactly 3 p.m., just as she'd promised. She was a small woman, probably in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who spent her days saving children's lives. "Sarah," she said, extending her hand, "you look just like him. The same eyes, the same expression when you're thinking hard about something." We drove to her home in Ballard, a modest 2-story house with a small garden that reminded me of the one Dad had been working in when he died. The living room was filled with family photographs, graduations, weddings, birthday parties spanning several decades. "This is my family," Dr. Nguyen said, gesturing to the photos. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, all American citizens living productive lives. None of this would exist without your father. She led me to a particular photograph, a black-and-white image of a young woman holding a baby, standing next to a much younger version of my father. Both were covered in mud, and Dad was wearing military fatigues I'd never seen before. That's me and my son Tommy in 1971. I was 19 years old, and Tommy was 6 months. We'd been living in the tunnels for 8 months, hiding from the bombing campaigns that were destroying our village. She traced her finger along Dad's face in the photograph. "The first time I saw your father, I thought he was going to kill us. He came down into our tunnel with a flashlight and a rifle, and I was holding Tommy, trying to keep him quiet because babies crying in the tunnels meant death for everyone." "What happened?" He looked at me, at my baby, at the families huddled in the darkness, and he put down his rifle. He said something in English that I didn't understand then, but I learned later. He said, "Jesus Christ, they're just kids." Dr. Nguyen moved to another photograph, this one showing a group of Asian families standing in front of what looked like a church. "Your father spent 3 weeks planning our escape. He had to map out alternative tunnel routes, coordinate with Father McKenna in Saigon, and figure out how to move 63 people without anyone noticing. The most dangerous part was that he had to keep going back to the tunnels for his regular missions, pretending everything was normal, while secretly planning our evacuation. Weren't you afraid he might change his mind, turn you in?" "Every day, but he kept coming back, bringing us food, medicine, news from the outside. He learned some Vietnamese phrases so he could communicate with the elders. He brought toys for the children, little things he'd traded for with other soldiers." She showed me another photo, this one of Dad sitting cross-legged on the ground with several small children clustered around him, all of them looking at something in his hands. He was teaching them card tricks, magic tricks. He said every child should know at least one magic trick, even in a war. The image hit me harder than I'd expected. I could see Dad so clearly in that moment. The gentle giant who had taught me to ride a bike, who had always had time for my questions, who had never raised his voice even when I'd pushed every boundary a teenager could find. The night of our escape, your father came to the tunnels one last time, not in uniform. He was wearing civilian clothes he'd bought in Saigon. He led us through tunnels I didn't even know existed, tunnels that connected to a drainage system that emptied near the monastery. Dr. Nguyen's voice grew quiet, reflective. "I remember holding Tommy and following your father through water that was sometimes up to our chests. The children were so scared, but your father kept making jokes, doing magic tricks with his flashlight, anything to keep them calm. It took us 6 hours to reach safety. And then what happened? Father McKenna had arranged for us to stay at the monastery until transportation could be arranged to Saigon. From there, some families went to refugee camps in Thailand, others to camps in the Philippines. My family was sponsored by a Catholic church in San Jose." She pulled out a worn manila envelope and removed several letters, all written in Dad's familiar handwriting. Your father wrote to me every month for the first 2 years after we came to America. He sent money, not much, because he was young and didn't have much, but enough to help with English classes, with school supplies for Tommy. He helped us find our first apartment, our first jobs. I read through the letters, recognizing Dad's careful script and his slightly formal way of writing. The letters were full of questions about Tommy's health, about Dr. Nguyen's progress in school, about whether they needed anything. Each letter ended the same way. You are safe now, you are home, you are family. When I graduated from nursing school in 1979, your father was there. When I got married in 1983, he walked me down the aisle because my own father had died in the war. When Tommy graduated from high school, your father was in the audience cheering louder than anyone. The scope of Dad's involvement in their lives was staggering. This wasn't just a one-time rescue, this was a lifetime commitment to people he'd saved. Dr. Nguyen, did you know other families that my father helped? Her face lit up. Oh, Sarah, there are so many. Your father saved 63 people from those tunnels, but his work didn't stop there. Over the years, he helped sponsor more refugees, helped other families get settled in America. Would you like to meet some of them? 2 hours later, I was sitting in the community room of a Vietnamese community center in South Seattle, surrounded by more than 30 people whose lives had been touched by my father. They ranged in age from elderly men and women who had been young parents in the tunnels, to middle-aged professionals who had been children then, to younger adults who were the American-born children and grandchildren of the original refugees. The stories they told painted a picture of my father that was both familiar and completely foreign. They knew him as Uncle Robert, a man who showed up for every important moment in their lives, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who helped with college applications and job interviews and wedding planning. Your father taught me to drive, said a man named David Pham who owned a successful chain of restaurants in California. I was 17 and my parents were too scared to learn themselves. Uncle Robert spent every Saturday for 2 months teaching me in the parking lot of a closed shopping mall. He helped me with my medical school applications, added Dr. Nguyen. He didn't understand all the science, but he knew how to write a compelling personal statement. He helped me tell my story in a way that admissions committees would understand. When my restaurant was struggling during the recession, Uncle Robert drove down from Portland every weekend for 3 months to help me reorganize my business plan, David continued. He didn't know anything about the restaurant business, but he knew about hard work and integrity and treating people right. An elderly woman named Mrs. Tran spoke in accented English. Robert came to my husband's funeral, sat in back, very quiet. After service, he came to me and said, Mrs. Tran, your husband was a good man. I promise to help you however you need. He helps me with paperwork, with Social Security, with everything. For 15 years, he called me every week to make sure I was okay. As I listened to story after story, I began to understand the full scope of what Dad had built. This wasn't just a group of people he'd helped. This was a community, an extended family that spanned multiple generations and geographical boundaries. He had been the patriarch of a family he'd never told us about, a father figure to dozens of people who had loved him and depended on him for decades. Sarah, Dr. Nguyen said as the evening wound down, there's something else you need to know. Your father never accepted anything in return for his help. Not money, not gifts, nothing. When we tried to thank him, he would always say the same thing, you don't thank family. But why did he keep it a secret from us? An older man named Mr. Duke, who had been one of the elders in the tunnels, spoke up. Your father was ashamed. Ashamed of saving you? Ashamed that he had to lie to his commanders to do it. In his mind, he was a soldier who disobeyed orders. He never forgave himself for that, even though those orders were wrong. Dr. Nguyen nodded. Your father carried enormous guilt about Vietnam, not about saving us. He never regretted that. But about the other times, the missions where he couldn't save people, where he had to follow orders he hated, the families we lost before he found us. I thought about Dad's nightmares, about the way he'd sometimes stare off into space during family dinners, about how he'd always change the channel when war movies came on television. He never talked about the war because it was too heavy, Mrs. Tran said quietly. Too much sadness mixed with too much guilt. Easier to pretend it never happened than to explain all the complicated feelings. As the evening ended, each person approached me individually to share their contact information and to extend invitations. Tommy Nguyen, now a successful engineer, wanted me to meet his children. David Pham insisted I visit his restaurants so he could cook for me the way Dad had loved. Mrs. Tran invited me to stay with her whenever I was in Seattle, because Uncle Robert's daughter is my daughter too. But it was Dr. Nguyen who pulled me aside for the most important conversation. "Sarah, we want to do something to honor your father's memory. Something public, something that tells his story. What do you have in mind?" "The Vietnamese American Community Center is planning a memorial garden. We want to dedicate it to your father and to all the veterans who helped refugees after the war. Would you be willing to speak at the dedication ceremony?" I thought about my family, about their reaction to learning about Dad's military service, about their desire to keep everything quiet and private. "Yes," I said. "I'd be honored." The drive back to Portland gave me 4 hours to think about everything I'd learned. Dad hadn't just been a construction worker who happened to be a veteran. He hadn't just been a good father who helped the occasional homeless veteran. He had been the center of a vast network of people whose lives he'd touched, changed, and improved over the course of decades. And he'd done it all in secret, carrying the weight of his Vietnam experiences alone, never asking for recognition or thanks. When I got home, I found 17 voicemails on my phone. 13 were from members of my Vietnamese American family, as I'd started thinking of them, sharing more stories about Dad or extending additional invitations. 3 were from Marcus, each progressively more agitated, demanding to know what I was doing in Seattle and whether I was stirring up trouble about Dad's military service. The last voicemail was from Mom. Her voice was tight, controlled. "Sarah, Marcus told me you went to Seattle to meet with some people about your father's war service. We need to talk. Come over tomorrow evening." I deleted Marcus's messages without listening to them completely, but I saved the ones from Dad's Vietnamese family. Their stories, their gratitude, their love for him, that was what mattered. That was his real legacy. The next evening, I sat in Mom's living room for the second time in 2 months, but this time I felt different. I wasn't the excluded daughter hoping for acceptance. I was Robert Mitchell's child, carrying on his work of quiet heroism, and I was done apologizing for who I was. "I know what you did in Seattle," Mom said without preamble. "Marcus hired someone to look into those people you met with." "Marcus hired a private investigator to spy on me?" "He was concerned. We all were. These people could be making up stories, trying to take advantage of our grief." I stared at her. "Mom, these are people Dad helped for 40 years. They have photographs, letters, documentation. They're not making anything up." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. "The point is that your father had an entire life I knew nothing about, 43 years of marriage, and he was a stranger to me." For the first time, I began to understand Mom's reaction. This wasn't about protecting Dad's privacy or maintaining family dignity. This was about a woman who had just discovered that the man she'd lived with for over 4 decades had been keeping massive secrets from her. "Mom, he kept the secrets to protect you, to protect all of us." From what? From the weight of what he'd seen, what he'd done. From the guilt he carried about the war, about the people he couldn't save. Or maybe, she said, her voice growing harder, he kept the secrets because he didn't trust us, because he thought we weren't strong enough to handle the truth. I saw the hurt in her eyes, the deep wound of feeling like her husband had never really let her into his heart. But I also saw something else. Fear that if Dad's story became public, people would wonder what kind of wife doesn't know her husband was a decorated war hero. "What do you want me to do, Mom? Pretend I never learned any of this? Pretend Dad wasn't a hero?" "I want you to be careful. These people, this story, it could get complicated. There might be legal implications, financial obligations." "You mean the families Dad helped might ask for something?" "I mean, we don't know what your father promised them over the years. What if they think they're entitled to part of his estate? What if there are debts or obligations we don't know about?" I realized then that Mom's fear wasn't just about feeling deceived. She was worried about money, about protecting the modest inheritance Dad had left behind. "Mom, these people don't want Dad's money. They want to honor his memory. They want to tell his story. And I want to keep private things private. Your father obviously had his reasons for not sharing this with us. Maybe we should respect that. Or maybe we should respect the fact that he saved innocent lives and spent 40 years helping refugees build new lives in America. Maybe we should be proud of that. The conversation continued for another hour, circling the same arguments, the same fears, the same fundamental disagreement about what we owed Dad's memory. In the end, Mom made her position clear. She wanted me to distance myself from Dad's Vietnamese family, to stop digging into his war record, and to let the dead rest in peace. I made my position equally clear. I was going to continue learning about Dad's life, I was going to maintain relationships with the people he'd helped, and I was going to speak at the Memorial Garden dedication. If you do this, Mom said as I was leaving, you're going to tear this family apart. No, Mom, I replied. Dad's death already did that. I'm just deciding which family I want to be part of. The one that's ashamed of who he really was, or the one that's proud of him. 3 weeks later, I stood before a crowd of more than 200 people in the Vietnamese American Community Center's new Memorial Garden. The crowd included dozens of refugees Dad had helped over the years, their children and grandchildren, other veterans who had worked with refugee resettlement programs, and community leaders from across the Pacific Northwest. Marcus, Elena, and Mom were not there. But as I spoke about my father, about his courage in the tunnels of Vietnam, about his decades of quiet service to refugee families, about the legacy of compassion he'd left behind, I felt more connected to him than I ever had when he was alive. My father kept these stories secret because he thought they were too heavy to share, I said, looking out at the faces of people whose lives he'd touched. But I've learned that some stories are too important to keep secret. Some legacies are too valuable to hide. After the ceremony, as people shared their own memories of Dad and thanked me for honoring his story, I realized something important. I hadn't lost my family when I chose to embrace Dad's hidden legacy. I'd found a bigger family, one built on the foundation of service and sacrifice that he'd established decades before I was born. Dr. Nguyen approached me as the crowd was dispersing, carrying a small wrapped package. "This is for you," she said, "from all of us." Inside was a framed photograph I'd never seen before. It showed Dad at what appeared to be a family gathering, surrounded by dozens of people of all ages. He was laughing, his arm around an elderly Vietnamese woman, with children clustered at his feet and young adults standing behind him. At the bottom of the frame was an engraved plaque, "Robert Mitchell, beloved father, hero, family." "When was this taken?" I asked. "Last Christmas, at David Pham's house in Sacramento. Your father drove down for our annual reunion. We've been having them for 20 years. He was so proud that day, talking about his daughters and his son, showing pictures of his grandchildren." I studied the photograph, seeing Dad as I'd never seen him before, relaxed, genuinely happy, surrounded by people who loved him, not despite his Vietnam experiences, but because of them. "Sarah," Dr. Nguyen said gently, "you were always part of this family. Your father talked about you constantly. He was so proud of your work with the community center, of the way you helped people. He said you got that from him, that desire to serve others." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the choice I'd made. I had chosen truth over comfort, connection over conformity, legacy over secrecy. I'd chosen to honor the full complexity of who my father had been, rather than settling for the simplified version my birth family preferred. It wasn't an easy choice. The rift with Mom, Marcus, and Elena would take years to heal, if it ever healed at all. But for the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I was living up to the example he'd set, quietly, consistently choosing to do what was right rather than what was easy. Dad had spent his life saving people and then hiding that fact from the world. I was going to spend mine making sure his story was told, his sacrifices were remembered, and his legacy of service continued. In the end, that felt like the most fitting tribute I could give to the man who had taught me, through his example, that being a hero doesn't require recognition. It just requires showing up when people need you most. And I was finally ready to show up. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.